Excellent. So as people will come and join as we go, but I think we can make a start now. So welcome everyone. Delighted you can join us for what promises to be an important and insightful discussion around the theme of deindustrialization today. I'm Michael Aldous, Senior Lecturer in Management here at Queen's, Director of the Long Run Initiative. As chair of today's discussion, I'm looking forward to introducing you to four leading academic and industry experts who will address the theme from a number of different angles. First, I would like to thank the Chief Executives Club, particularly Dolores and Joanne, for their continued support of the LRI and all the effort they put into enabling these events. They do sterling work in bringing together many of the university's important stakeholder groups and providing platforms for the academic community to engage beyond our ivory towers. So thank you to both of you. I would also just like to say a few words about the LRI, or Long Run Initiative. For those of you unfamiliar with what we do, we're a not-for-profit entity supported by the Centre for Economic History here at Queen's under the auspices of our director, Professor John Turner, and also supported by Signal Influence, a boutique Canadian consulting firm that's home to our founder and director, Lawrence Muscio, one of Canada's leading business historians. As a group, we believe in the importance of providing leaders and decision makers in the corporate, public and third sectors with insights into long-run trends that are shaping grand challenges and wicked problems that all organisations are grappling with. In these turbulent times, we believe that there is much that can be learned from an understanding of historical antecedents, events and processes that shape the world we live in now. Through the LRI, we look to bring together these constituent groups along with academics to foster opportunities for discussion on significant topics, and through these discussions to sort of generate understanding of the long run and to build from that insight from hindsight. This is actually now our sixth event. We have recently looked at topics as varied as the history and future of the public corporation, big tech and monopolies, productivity and information revolutions. So we're really excited to sort of be looking at deindustrialization, the theme for today's discussion. We think this fits very nicely with the sort of the grand challenges, wicked problems, sort of active, events we've been looking at, particularly due to the sort of the importance of long run antecedents in shaping these challenges. Industrialization of economies and the policy prescriptions that have sought to enable these outcomes have been central to much economic and political decision-making across the 20th century. Industrial firms and jobs and the promise of them had come to dominate economies and societies across the world. Yet by the latter half of the 20th century, we've seen the emergence and increasing pace of deindustrialization in various regions. And by deindustrialization here, what we're thinking about is the decline in manufactured output and a related decline in employment. So really, we're thinking here about loss of industrial firms and jobs. So to give you an example of the scale of some of these challenges, US employment in manufacturing sectors peaked at over 20 million in the 1970s, but this is estimated to fall to less than 12 million by 2026. Similarly, when we look at UK manufacturing output in terms of its value add to the total economy, this is the UK, this has declined from 17% in 1990 to under 10% in 2018. So these sort of trends are having profound economic, social and political outcomes. Huge economic concerns have now been generated due to the loss of strategic manufacturing industries, trade imbalances, decreasing technological dynamism, lack of industrial competitiveness, often sort of linked to a loss of skills. These processes have had devastating effects on social welfare, rise of long-term unemployment, urban decay, social dislocation, leading to sort of increasingly, as we've seen recently, increasingly extreme political responses. And this is often at a regional level. So this has provoked significant rethinking about industrial and trade policy and corporate strategy as nations and companies grapple with this issue. So in many ways, what we've seen is actually a sort of a manufacturing renaissance or a call for reindustrialization on the basis that manufacturing is a key engine of economic growth. It's a crucial source of high quality employment, and that producing tradable goods is essential sort of when we think about trade balances. So this is a really important topic and a significant challenge facing sort of policymakers and corporate leaders. And to address this, I'm really delighted to welcome our 4 panelists. Today, we have Dr. Judy Stevenson, Associate Professor of Economics and Finance at the Bartlett School from the University College of London. She's an economic historian of labour markets, organisations and employment. She's at the forefront of research that is challenging our understanding of the Industrial Revolution, and through that will help us reframe the context of industrialisation and deindustrialisation. Next, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Graham Brownlow, Senior Lecturer in Economics at Queen's University Belfast. He's an economist and business historian who has extensively studied the impact of government policy on economic development, and through this work speaks widely to political and corporate audiences. He's also recently been appointed to the Northern Ireland Productivity Forum. Third, I'd like to welcome Professor Titanka Roy, Professor of Economic History at the London School of Economics, perhaps the preeminent economic historian of India, published extensively on South Asian history and economic development. Very important work in sort of developing our understanding around the debates of de- and reindustrialization within India, and will provide us today with a crucial comparative perspective. And finally, I would like to welcome Rosemary Stalker, current chair of InvestNI, highly experienced business leader, been on the executive team and board level appointments in organizations including Ford, Boeing and Rolls-Royce, so some of the largest industrial manufacturing companies in the world. Recently been appointed to the Economic Advisory Group here in Northern Ireland, and she's also co-founder of the NI Makers Productivity Panel, which seeks to provide a foundation on which to build resilient industrial growth in the post-COVID world. So a really important perspective as we think about sort of reindustrialization and these questions of how sort of policy and corporate strategy evolves to enable this. So the event will work as follows. Each of our panelists will provide some opening thoughts on the topic. We will then have a Q&A. Delighted to integrate any questions you may have. So post them up in the chat and I will do my very best to get to them as we go along. So to start the discussion, I would like Judy to turn on her camera. And her work has been really fundamental in starting to rethink the causes of industrialization. And I think that's a really important place for us to start. This is obviously, people have been trying to understand industrialization and its causes for 200 years now. So what's new? And what do we sort of need to understand beyond spinning jennies and coal when we think about the causes of industrialization? Judy, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for such a warm welcome, Michael, and it's lovely to see so many people online, and thank you for organising this. It's particularly at a time like this, it's so nice to share scholarship with both practitioners and people actually doing real life business. I've got some slides describing the reasons for the Industrial Revolution in sort of 6 or 7 minutes. Is a trap in many academic circles. So forgive the sort of gloss to this one, because I'm trying to sort of summarize a lot of stuff. So if you have detailed questions, I'm really very happy to answer more specific ones. So I've got some slides that try to pull together the latest research from here. Can everybody see that? Give me a thumbs up, Michael, if it's good. It's good. Okay, so the first thing I'm just going to point out is that actually what we're talking about, if you can see this slide, is a much more gradual process. Generally growth and the move from one sector to another, from everything we know about economic history, is a very gradual process. What I want you to notice about this slide, which gives you growth rates in the very long run, is that the bit that everybody gets excited about, the 18th century, is actually a very stable, moderate growth over the very long period. And until the end of the century, stability is actually what characterizes the 18th century. And after that, there was a sharp increase in inequality and some very high investment and some very low wages. But generally, stability is a good thing when you're talking about growth. So that bears thinking about. So in order to sort of get the conversation going, I'm going to highlight that the latest research really stresses the important role in industrialization and growth in four things. First of all, high human capital, particularly what we call upper tail human capital, which is scientists, researchers, developers, in technologically focused occupations. But the importance of high human capital and a flexible labor force to this period of change cannot be understated. Second of all the research points to the fact that Britain industrialized first, not because of anything exceptional about Britain, but in a context of very long run investment in science, knowledge, and the institutions around those things. Thirdly, services, what we would now today call professional services, were extremely strong and well developed before industrialization. There's an increasing focus on the service industries as drivers of growth rather than manufacturing. And fourthly, market size. There were the strong incentives to increase productivity and output in areas that were growing and where there were large opportunities for increasing output and profit. So to touch on all of those, the labor force, which is my specialty, there's a lot of debate on this, and the characteristics for growth that speak out over and over again are very highly skilled technicians. People who are very able from an engineering or technical point of view, combined with less skilled mobile workers whose flexibility in employment terms is very important. The other characteristic that seems notable today is everywhere in the pre-industrial period, we see supply chains of lots and lots of little SMEs who are very specialized and very expert. Petty capitalists, they're called in some of the old literature, but we call them SMEs. Over and over again, we see the importance of, for workers, human capital that was skilled, flexible, adaptable, cheap. And that obviously has policy implications because nobody who invested in this period or in subsequent periods of industrialization really worried about wages. And a big component of 18th century wage contracts are their flexibility. The idea of unemployment is just everywhere. And that's something we have to think about in today's world as well. In terms of the investment in science and knowledge, this was both state-led and private order. There's a very long-running investment in human capital, which goes right back to sort of church institutions in the Middle Ages, which led to that technical innovation. There's lots of excellent research on scientific research emerging from collaborations between different kinds of scholars, the Royal Society. There's a system of reward with patents, but really it's the market for investment that inventors and technical experts are also interested in. And what we know about the conditions generally is there's a huge amount of mechanical and technical skill amongst working people in this period. So that science knowledge is everywhere. It's not just in the upper tail. So a knowledgeable population who know how to do things. Another areas that is emerging in recent scholarship is very well developed trade networks and strong institutions that supported trade contracts and supported exchange and trade. There's a very strong but heterogeneous legal system that deals very quickly, regionally and centrally with disputes. Everybody who's worked on 18th century contracts knows how incredibly well specified they can be, even if they are brief. There is a long history of significant investment in transport and distribution and returns to that. And what's beginning to emerge in a lot of literature is how guilds and other trade-specific networks, rather than sort of regulating industry, which is what old research is about, actually created coalitions and standards that enabled more exchange. So that's where the kind of the accent in recent research is on. And then stressing that the sort of factor that affects all of these, which is market size. there were, I have the little map at the lowest thing there, the export market for textiles, for machinery, for intermediate goods in Great Britain and beyond, not just because of colonial links, but linked to the colonial circumstances and investments. The market size and potential was significant. And some of the most interesting research shows how profit-driven investors were. They weren't investing in the common good. They expected profit in the short and the long run from these new ventures. And they recognized market size as a factor which could yield extra profit. So export markets and new emerging markets are important to any story of industrialization or growth. So to summarize what's sort of going on in what we know about this, there is no one cause. You know, so you're not going to get a mono, all we have to do is, and this will follow. Research has highlighted that conditions were also different in every state or region that industrialized over the following 200 years. So the key drivers that I've just discussed are all necessary, but not sufficient. But what I'd like to stress is that the relevant points for today, and I'm hoping, you know, that we might get some questions on this, is that the very strong relationships with well-developed services, particularly professional services, in terms of consultancy, design, engineering and design, and legal, financial, others, and the high level of human capital and the flexibility of labor are themes that we can probably move on. I hope that wasn't too glossed over.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Judy. That was absolutely spot on and great for time. So thank you for that overview. Now, if you turn off, I'm going to call up Graham Brownlow. And I think that's what we've sort of seen there. Graham is a really interesting sort of overview of the key drivers of industrialization and some of the factors that have motivated this. But of course, when we start now turning towards the question of deindustrialization, you know, perhaps you could sort of, you know, talk us through a little bit from, you know, what happens in the 20th century, sort of within the UK experience, as to sort of when do we start to see deindustrialization come in, and sort of what are some of the causes of this?
Okay, so my preliminary comments, it's very much a story of thanking Judy for setting up the story of what goes up, and I'm going to do what comes down. In terms of the headline point, when it starts coming down much earlier than a lot of people understand. The story of deindustrialization in the UK is a classic example of the difference between economic history and economist history, because the peak year is roughly about 1955 for employment as a proportion, manufacturing employment as a proportion of total employment. So what I'm going to do in the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to set up some headline findings and then talk a bit about phases and then talk a little bit about some of the consequences. Okay, so if we want to tell the story about deindustrialization, I think we can tell it in a variety of ways. Okay, and it has been told in a variety of ways. There's no doubt that we can tell it's a story about equity and efficiency, and I think a lot of it is actually about microeconomics rather than macroeconomics. So I think later on we can talk a bit more about corporate strategy and structure, things we think about as microeconomic phenomena. I think we're going to see are actually there in the story. If we want to tell the story at the headline in an optimistic way, we could tell it as a sort of Schumpeterian story of creative destruction, where good business models chase out bad business models or inferior business models. That would be an optimistic way of telling the story. But we could equally, particularly now, in what I'm going to call De-industrialization 3.0, perhaps tell a more pessimistic story of moving from a making stuff economy to a taking stuff economy. Because a lot of the political economy aspects that you talked about in your introduction, when we think about the UK and wider, may actually be related to that move from making stuff to taking stuff. But if I want to make three concrete points to try and make sense of the UK experience from, say, 1945 to the present day, the first is that deindustrialization has both a supply side and a demand side. It's amazing in the readings about deindustrialization, how simple price theory is often forgotten. There's a demand side and a supply side. On the demand side, there are stories about income elasticity. And on the supply side, there are stories about employment, output, productivity. And we can talk more detail later on about that. The second point would be, when we talk about deindustrialization, as Judy talked about, there's output and employment. In the British case, peak employment year is 1955 for GB. It's 1962 for Northern Ireland. Crucially, however, output deindustrialization, in other words, the share of output in manufacturers, the share of total output, shrinks much, much later. So there's a clue there in that second point about the story and how we tell the story about deindustrialization. And the third preliminary point is that what we're talking about is mature countries, mature deindustrialization. In other words, the peak for the UK in 1955 was about 47% of all people employed in the UK were employed in manufacturing. If, however, we look at deindustrialization in the less developed countries, which Tanaka will come on to, we can talk about premature deindustrialization, where the peak shares are anywhere down to 18%, and the level of national income is much, much lower. So we put that all together, we can ask a question again, the extent to which the UK was unusual as the first industrial nation, becoming the first deindustrial nation. There's a debate we can talk about later on about that. In terms of my three phases, I'll talk about the consequences. The points to make are, I think the first phase of deindustrialization is linked into the long boom or golden age from 45 to 73. It's clear deindustrialization kicked in here in Northern Ireland and throughout the United Kingdom long before the oil shock. If we look at the second phase, that's a story that's similar to the first phase, but with policy errors about monetarism, an overemphasis, however, in a lot of economist discussions about crowding out and North Sea oil. And then if we look in the last 20 years, arguably deindustrialization has accelerated in the UK, and that's really a story to globalization, a shift to the east, artificial intelligence, all the stuff, yada yada, that we all know about. All of this means that I think we're talking about three different processes. If we're talking about reindustrialization, the question comes, is this really going to be an illusion, a dead cat bounce, as they would say in financial markets, rather than something phenomenal? And then last but not least, when we think about the consequences of deindustrialization, in stark contrast to the earlier literature that was very much in economics literature, we can talk about the fact that deindustrialization in the UK is linked to spatial and structural problems and how they become entwined in the UK. We can talk about agglomerations and why not all regions, just as Judy said, could participate in the Industrial Revolution. Not all regions will participate in reindustrialization or benign deindustrialization. And last and not least, the question about deaths of despair, health, welfare, and the big questions that are now emerging in the contemporary literature about globalization, I think are all tied in with the story of British deindustrialization. So in other words, economists and economic historians can tell stories, but if we move from stylized facts to facts, economic history, we can pin it down into a much longer run story from 1945 to the present day and beyond. And I think we can start saying that there are a variety of processes going on. And I think that's probably a good point at which I could wind up. Okay.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Graham. So I think that's a really interesting sort of contextualization, that we have a long run sort of lead in through industrialization, and as sort of the forces and causes of industrialization evolve over time. So we have this long run deindustrialization, and this is multi-causal, and we have different phases here which are being driven by different sort of factors and causes. So that's set that up really nicely. Now, I'm really excited and really delighted to welcome Professor Tatanka Roy. You know, and really this is an opportunity to rethink this in a sort of a comparative way, and rethink, you know, some of the sort of the phasing and the causes here, because of course India has gone through a very, very different sort of pattern of de and re-industrialization. So Tatanka, if you could sort of talk a little bit to us about the sort of the causes and consequences of this in the Indian context.
Thank you, Michael. I'm delighted to be here, all the more because deindustrialization has a deep connection with my personal biography as a historian. So let me start with a bit of personal history here. I did college education in India in 1970s and 1980s. The history courses I did at that time in India were extremely nationalistic in sentiment. And deindustrialization was a key word in the curriculum and a word with enormous influence, moral, political, intellectual. To see why, I need to digress a bit into economic theory. About 250 years ago, Adam Smith popularized the idea that market exchange incentivized specialization, the rule that countries devote themselves to those activities for which they are best suited. If they followed that rule, every country will grow richer. That was the message. Now, there was nothing wrong with the theory, but it had a terribly, hugely controversial message. Western Europe, which was Western Europe, which was starting to industrialize in Adam Smith's time, should continue to do so, should continue to industrialize, whereas the tropical regions, which had quite well-developed craft industries, should withdraw from industry. That is, they should deindustrialize. They should deindustrialize and specialize in agricultural exports instead. The world did get divided more or less in this fashion in the next 150 years. But it also got more unequal in the process. Not everybody became rich in the same way. And by the middle of the 20th century, the appeal of this theory of specialization had collapsed completely. Every country wanted to industrialize. Deindustrialization and specialization were dead concepts in policy making. But it was not dead in the classroom. And deindustrialization, when I was a college student, conjured up deep resentment in the emerging economies of that time. Why resentment? Because India had been a colony of Britain's until 1947. And we were told that using its power to impose free trade on its colonies, zero tariff trade, using Adam Smith as an excuse, of course, Britain had obstructed industrialization in the colonies and caused a deindustrialization there. It was created, it was a constructed thing. India, which once employed millions of people in high quality textiles and supplied cloth all over the world, was left in ruins. Machine-made goods from Manchester and the British cotton textile lobby, supported by a free trader colonial state, decimated the handmade cloth business in India, deepening poverty. Now, when I was a doctoral student, there was no other story to tell about the craft industries. This was the story. But a few odd critics thought that the story was a little too extreme. Around 1950 in India, 10 million people still earned a living in craft industries using manual skills. If deindustrialization is the only story to tell, why did these guys exist? What were they doing? That argument, that question intrigued me, and I wanted to find out what really happened. And I discovered that industrial England did export a lot of cotton textiles to India in the 1800s. It did destroy quite a lot of jobs, but the impact overall on Indian industry was very uneven. Mechanized production could not copy a whole range of manual and design skills. So a huge range of cloths made by hand, and practically the entire class of women's wear called saris, did not compete with British textiles at all, because these cloths involved skills that the machines could not copy and which the consumers valued. And the makers of these clothing gained from free trade because they could access cheaper raw materials and new types of tools. So how do we read this story? When technologies change, obsolescence happens. That's a fact of life. But there is also another fact of life, which is that there is often, almost always, a pushback against obsolescence at the same time. In this example, the pushback built on design skills, which imparts some kind of quality on the product. The theory of specialization and deindustrialization, which we had learned in college, could deal with competition on price, not on quality. Dealing with quality was a much more complicated project because it needed understanding how consumers value products. In the last 15, 20 years, I have interacted a lot with people working in textile exports from India and textile designers, the National Institute of Design alumni. and become more convinced that this is actually what many people engaged in high quality products do believe, that a variety of craft skills have had an unbelievably long life because design skills work like a capital. These skills can be saved, they can be stored, they can be lent, they can be inherited, they can be deployed on different objects and materials. That's the message I'm left with, and it's a somewhat positive message. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Tatanka. I think that's a really, really intriguing sort of idea here that, you know, first of all, we understand deindustrialization in the long run in terms of, you know, the phasing and how this affects different economies in different parts of the world. It affects them at different times in different ways, but we have this long run adaptation in the face of this, and that we see, you know, that through sort of specialization, the development of skills that can then be adapted in the long run over very long periods of time to sort of retain manufacturing and industrial sort of presence in different sort of industries that can still be highly competitive. So I think that's a very interesting sort of way of looking at deindustrialization and the sort of the consequences of it. So I'm now delighted to ask Rosemary Stalker if she can turn on, if she's ready.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you great. Yeah.
Just waiting for the video to...
That's fine, you're on.
Okay, it hasn't quite made it to the depths of Glenavy right now.
That's okay, we can and hear you, we're all good. Yeah, so wonderful, thank you, Rosemary. So I just want to start by, you know, this idea, and you sort of, you know, talking about the, you know, we talked about the resilient industrial growth in a post-COVID world, and we've talked about sort of the forces and factors shaping industrialization and then shaping deindustrialization, but also this sort of quest about what comes next and reindustrialization and, you know, sort of the renaissance in manufacturing. So what I was really interested is sort of your thoughts on sort of where the motivation and the momentum will come from in sort of driving this agenda. What will sort of push this, who's going to push this forward, and how's this going to happen?
Michael, thank you very much, and it's great to listen to the other members of the panel and their perspectives on this. I must admit to not having done an awful lot of research, and my comments are largely based on my sort of personal experience and more latterly looking at the Northern Ireland economy and looking forwards. And, you know, to me, and this might sound a little bit like heresy, and in a way it's sort of following on a little bit from what Graham was saying, with regards to, you know, these things aren't necessarily fast in terms of transformations, and are we in the middle of, you know, reindustrialization or deindustrialization? I sort of am completely agnostic here. What I'm looking at is economic success. What does economic success look like? And is industrialization a critical part of that? So economic growth is the driver that matters, I think, to any region. You know, a positive balance of trade. You know, we need this to fund our healthcare, to fund our education, to fund society. And it's interesting, some of the comments that Judy made, particularly those sort of four factors, and the importance of skills. And I noticed some of the questions sort of starting to float in. There are some fundamental changes and in terms of the self-determination of society, and what impact that's going to have on the future of skills and choice. And, you know, one of the things, and I'll come to your question in a moment, but one of the things I felt really important is that, you know, Northern Ireland Invest is not a policymaker. Obviously, it has a lot of information, a lot of involvement, stimulating and supporting economic growth in Northern Ireland. And our assembly has got a goal of driving prosperity. And I really like that word, prosperity. And I think what's important moving forward with economies is, you know, that the history tells us that we've got increased separation of the haves and have-nots. True success is really going to be where, you know, we have that leveling up, and we have prosperity for all. Now, the experts on the panel may tell me that's a utopia, it ain't going to happen ever, but I think that should be the goal. And if I take labour and the skills market for a moment, one of the things that is a consequence of where we are today in a living with COVID and the acceleration of digitization that COVID has brought to us is the labour market is global and the labour market is actually virtual. The competition for people is now not limited by the distance people can travel to work. There is no limit now. It is going to become much more of a choice, and the choice is going to be resting with those people who have the skills that everybody wants. So that is a fundamental change in the marketplace. So what do regions, societies need to do in order to address that? Well, it's obvious. We need to do everything in our power to upskill, reskill, and build capability, local capability, and bring everyone up to a level where their skills reflect the needs of the future world of work. So I think that's a given. Now, so back to your question, what are those factors? I think that you know, it is absolutely correct that there's a skills dimension of this, there's an investment dimension of this, there's a market dimension of this, and there's a technology dimension of this. And when they are together, there is a latent need, or whether there's an opportunity, that's where we get transformational change. So the situation we are at now in Northern Ireland is COVID has accelerated a lot of remote working, online services. Brexit has accelerated some of the trade challenges. And what Northern Ireland needs to do is to look at that and say, okay, how can we make the best of this situation, and where do the opportunities lie? Now, there will be niches, and the obvious place for us to go is to understand where we have that combination of unique global world-class capability and either explicit or latent potential demand. That obviously for me includes the skills as well. So understanding those, supporting those, is core, I think, to success in this arena. But the other piece of this is that this is huge. And when it was easy for a couple of companies, or even one company, to get its arms around the situation and say, right, well, we're going to drive digital in our business and drive transformational growth so that our new products are going to be better than the competitive products, and it's all within our own control. That's one thing. The challenge now is we've got to a situation where in many cases that is no longer the case. So let me give you an example of autonomous vehicles, and the fact that the emission requirements and the total life cycle requirements. So to sign off an autonomous vehicle, and I think the number is, it requires a vehicle to be driven 11 billion miles. And that's a report by the RAND organization determined this, which means it would take 500 years in order to demonstrate regulatory compliance using traditional methods. So here we are at a point of inflection. We cannot continue to deliver what the market is asking for using the conventional methods. So a transformation in how we engineer and sign off new products. So we need to create an accelerated digital engineering environments. We need to have enterprise co-creation and integration. We need to transform how we engineer the skills required to be able to deliver this capability. And we need to drive the standards. And I was also, it resonated very much with Judy and the comments she made about the sort of the trade networks, the coalition and the standards. You know, that's absolutely critical. There is no way even a very large company, other than maybe one of the sort of social media companies, can drive a standard. An engineering company can't drive a standard anymore. We actually need global organizations to help drive standards, or certainly coalitions to get critical masses of organizations to help drive standards, which are critical enablers to this. Because if you don't do that, you know, the investment in driving uniqueness is going to get you nowhere. It's just completely wasted investment. Sorry, that's probably a very long way around, and I hope I answered the question, Michael.
That was fantastic. I mean, there's some really interesting points there. I think, you know, again, this sort of re-emphasization of skills, you know, as being critical, but, you know, how they then embed with wider capabilities, both at the firm and industry level, is really interesting. And then, you know, as you say, you know, there's then this idea of sort of the ecosystem, if you like, that is required, where, you know, we're moving now, you know, one firm can't solve this, an industry can't solve this. It may well be, you know, multiple participants within the economy linking together to solve this, and who enables this, who fosters this, and the role of wider organizations, regulatory standards enabling, you know, this to occur efficiently, and in a sort of a, you know, efficient and productive manner, I think is a really important, you know, back to Judy's perspective about the networks and who's in the networks and what do they do and how do they facilitate this, I think becomes a really, really important question. You know, and I think, you know, this neatly identifies then a lot of the challenges we face. So thank you, Rosemary, that was great. What I'm going to do now is, if all speakers could come on, I think we've all sort of, you know, we've got some really, you know, good themes to work with here in the Q&A, and I'm beginning to get some questions, and I've also got quite a number of questions, but I think, you know, what I'd like to start with, you know, it's quite a fundamental question, you know, and it's really about, you know, the role of the state, the role of policy here, you know, in driving these outcomes, you know, and what role should government play? What role, you know, is there here for policy? You know, if we, you know, we'll come to Judy in a moment, but the idea of sort of very early industrialization being almost entirely private, you know, viewed as a very sort of private sector driven outcome, right the way through to talking now about the role of policy and, you know, regulation and sort of enabling people to come together. So I think, you know, I'm going to go around each of the sort of panelists and ask them to sort of comment and think, reflect a little bit on sort of the role of policy. So Judy, you had your hands up. If you could start, please.
Well, yeah, thank you. I saw some of the questions particularly pertain to labour and contracts and serfdom and all that. And certainly looking backwards, that is a big role of the state, whatever you want to call the state, be it the region, the parish, the manor, the whatever, welfare and welfare, some kind of welfare guarantee or safety net is the role of. And that particularly pertains to a lot of stuff that's happening in the chat, and also that I mentioned in relation to the difference between the outcomes for very skilled and very unskilled workers, and this flexibility question. The grim reality is we had the golden age of employment in the 20th century, as Graham told us. And you could say that work would take you out of poverty when work contracts were permanent jobs and where the real wage was rising. And those conditions were a little 50-year period in the 20th century. Normally, jobs are not permanent, you know, in the real world in the very long run, and the real wage doesn't rise. So if that is the case, we have to understand that in a policy perspective and actually think very purposefully about what we want to do to support people, you know, through the life cycle of employment and non-employment. And that is a role for the state. Nothing, no, you know, firms are not going to do that. Entrepreneurs are not going to do that. Thank you. Okay,
that's great. So Graham, you've thought a lot about the role of policy. You know, what's your view here around sort of the, you know, its role in, you know, reindustrialization, or sort of drive, you know, where we move forward to from here? What's the role of the government here?
Oh, okay, well, I think the biggest lesson from the literature on United Kingdom as a whole and Northern Ireland in particular is there's an easy tendency to fall for red herrings in policy. And the British economic history in the 20th century has often been a history of red herrings. So specifically in the case of deindustrialization, in connection with the UK and Northern Ireland, we had red herrings like the crowding out discussion of, you know, good private sector, bad public sector, and the whole idea that one would destroy the quote-unquote public sector in order that the quote-unquote wealth-generating private sector would solve all the problems. This obviously missed a lot of points. The most obvious, of course, is there's a lot of crowding out in the private sector through good public services. The other thing more recently, the Danny Roderick classic paper from '98, is that if we actually look at successful open economies, they tend to have larger governments as a share of national income. So I've written about this with Esmond Burney about in many ways the puzzle for Northern Ireland is not the large share of the public sector. It's the fact that the large share of the public sector did not come with a highly successful export sector in the last 20, 30, 40 years, whatever. So I think that a lot of red herrings have been used. I could develop the story even more by comparing what Germany got right or what independent Ireland got right in the last 20, 30 years with what Britain got wrong, but I'm not sure how much time I've got.
Yeah, give us the very condensed version.
The condensed version is that the Germans went for inflation stability and they went with competition policy. They got the micro right. They made the micro work and they generated better businesses that then could benefit from low inflation and exports. And it's no surprise when you have low inflation, high productivity, high investment, that leads to export growth, and export growth generates demand for manufacturers. And lo and behold, if we look at the share of employment manufacturers as a share of total employment, it stays higher in Germany longer than in Britain with high productivity. So there's a lot going on there. Britain, on the other hand, went for recurrent stop-go cycles, but Britain wasn't unique. I mean, Kevin O'Rourke's written about this. There's evidence that New Zealand, Australia, Canada, United States, there's an Anglo-American pattern, in other words. This takes us all into the varieties of capitalism literature, which again, your nice viewers might not appreciate a 2-minute primer in that, so I'll probably stop there.
Yeah, that's great, Graham. I mean, you know, so we'll move this on now to Tanka. India and the Indian state has played many diverse roles in sort of, you know, and had extreme policy sort of shifts in terms of its approach to industrialization across the 20th century. You know, based on this sort of long run, you know, shifts, what do you see now as the role of the state and the government in this space?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. If you look at India and several other emerging economies, which changed their policies quite radically in the 1990s, what you observe in the subsequent 20-odd years, or well, 30 years, is a retreat of the state, not on an absolute scale. I mean, if you look at, say, government taxes as GDP or government size as GDP, probably not much change has happened. But it has definitely moved away from regulating industry and investing in industry. So what it has done in respect of industry is to move away from regulating technology, deciding technology policy, regulating employment to some extent, towards attracting investment or promoting investment. So that's been the big change in most emerging economies in the last 25, 30 years. But one thing that complicates this story, and especially for India, is that when you look at what these new investments are, where private sector dominates, of course, much of it has gone to services and not to manufacturing. Now that creates a very particular set of policy challenges which are still not very well understood. What the government can do to improve, say, quality of workforce in services. Does it have any role at all? Or to regulate consumption, regulate technology? What are technologies in an IT firm? Who creates it? Who controls it? Where does it come from? And often if you go deeper into that question, it becomes extremely confusing because most IT products are made up of components which are produced in maybe 70, 80 different places. So the government really doesn't have any control, and this is going to get more complicated because the world is consuming much more services than before. It's not just a deindustrializing process. It is that industry itself relies a lot more on design skills and IT skills and other types of services which are not part of the shop floor workforce. We don't really know where it is headed, but I think part of that story is global. It's not just an emerging economy story.
That's great. Thank you. Rosemary, in terms of the role of the state, I was quite struck by sort of these conversations around skills and, you know, the development of skills and capabilities. And there seems to be quite a sort of significant debate about the extent to which this, you know, the development of these skills are driven through sort of state-led initiatives like universities, schooling, colleges, or the extent to which skills, you know, should be developed within private sector, within firms, and sort of become highly specialized. Do you have any thoughts about sort of where the impetus lies here in developing skills for the sort of the new economy, if you like?
Well, I think it's actually all of the above. And I think we could be well served to bring everything together so that not that everyone is doing the same thing, but what we actually have is complementary activity. And we have lots of successes with colleges and universities and groups of employers and sectors working together to respond to specific skill needs. But there's clearly a need to mobilize the skill processes and make them much more flexible. I mean, I'll talk from personal experience with regard to how we develop future engineers. I mean, the process for developing engineers largely hasn't changed in you know, probably in the last, I don't know, certainly in my lifetime, maybe even more so. In fact, probably my lifetime and my father's lifetime. So it's probably getting on to nearly 100 years, which is unbelievable, totally unbelievable. So, you know, I'm heartened by you know, some examples where groups of businesses, collaborative networks supported by organizations such as Invest and the Department of the Economy are looking at different ways to respond to the desperate need for new skills and to be able to encourage our brightest talent in the areas where we really need it. So yeah, I truly agree. I also think that reskilling is completely important. You know, this idea you're going to have one career, it's not going to be the case. It's multiple careers, and therefore, you know, we're continually learning, and therefore processes that enable us to reskill are important in that. But I just want to also come back on the policy point a little bit. You know, an organization such as Invest, as I said before, isn't a developer policy, but of course we are sort of implementing programs as a result of that. And in Invest history, there's been, you know, is it a push for jobs? Is it a push for improving productivity? And that old dilemma. And you know, Graham will be very familiar with that, with this new involvement with sort of the productivity group. But I like to think of this as competitiveness, and I actually am quite a supporter of that sort of global competitiveness index, because one of the things I like about that is it does bring in the skills dimension as well as the productivity dimension, and I do think that the challenge for us is how we move forward and how the policymakers in Northern Ireland move forward in that situation. Critical also is to recognise who we are. And what we are in this, in that, you know, we are a small business economy. I think it's, I might get this wrong, but 99,000 or something like that, small manufacturing only businesses in Northern Ireland. That's a huge number for such a very small area. So a solution that enables our manufacturing base to become competitive. Now, not every one of those is going to be globally competitive, but actually integrating them to effective, resilient, responsive supply chains in the future, and identifying early on what do we think are some of those key niches, some of those key areas when we look at this as a Northern Ireland part of the UK. What are the areas that UK is going to go after where it thinks it's going to have global capability opportunities and global growth opportunities? How can we complement that in Northern Ireland? How can we build that capability, harnessing what we already have? Absolutely key.
Right. Yeah. So I think one of the interesting things I've been picking up, we talk about, the idea of upskilling, reskilling, sort of redirecting, and reforming human capital and capabilities. But then we've also talked, and Judy, and we've sort of talked now, about, the need for flexibility and the need for adaptability. And then, we have this also fundamental question about being cheap and the cost of sort of labour. How do we reconcile this? I mean, it seems to me a sort of we need the investment in the people, but we also are expecting them to be flexible and adaptable. And then we also have a demand for them to be cheap. So sort of Rosemary, you had your hand up.
Well, yeah, I mean, this brings me back to being in industry. And part of the earlier conversation that we had with regards to price, and from my earliest time in industry, which is now more years than I care to acknowledge, it was never about just price. It was always about quality, cost, and timeliness, always. And we never ever had a discussion about one without the other two. And you could replace quality with customer satisfaction.
Yep. Judy?
Yeah, I mean, just to come in on that, from an economist perspective, as well as from a historians and practitioners perspective, the real question, as you allude to, is productivity. Unit cost is, in a relative sense. And I think that goes back to some of the questions people were asking about the role of the state. Education, continuing education, continuing skills relearning, and maintenance is an important part. It's not about cheap labor, but unproductive cheap labor. There is unfortunately a very big role for in today's service-based, tech-based economies. Low skilled work is a problem. Where if skills are not required, they won't be paid for. And that is the stuff that will be automated or should be automated. And the question is almost why it hasn't been automated yet. One of the reasons is the low skilled, very cheap labor is available. So policy, from a state or from an organization and from a corporate point of view, should be about training people to be more, in practical terms, training people, educating people to be more productive. Throughout the life cycle of their employment. But that's about investment that you don't see an instant return on. It's certainly not a quarterly reporting goal or even an annual reporting goal. And within the model of a sort of shareholder value driven investment model, it's very difficult to justify. That's one of the.
So it's a culture shift at both the corporate level in terms of sort of extending horizons and thinking about sort of, the focus on quality, productivity and the skills that go in and around that, but then also a culture shift at policy level that, the role of the state needs to fundamentally reappraise, how we think about skills and that development over the long period of time in people's life cycles. Sorry, Rosemary, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just a little point to add to what Judy's saying there. And actually, I think where there will be another factor that comes into this, and I alluded to it earlier, and that is the global market for talent. And the fact that those people who will have the skills will have the power of choice, and companies will be obligated to provide the lifelong learning opportunities for those people that they do want to maintain. And the core employability characteristics and potential of those individuals will, I do believe, change the competitive nature for talent. And I see that as a great opportunity, actually.
Yeah.
Great. So I'm going to pick up on a couple of questions, a number of questions that have been asked here, which is really about sort of the overarching purpose and sort of direction. Do we need to reindustrialize? Should that be a goal? In light of some of the conversations we've been having about sort of specialization and skills and, the capabilities and, availability of resources in regions or in nations, is reindustrialization a realistic goal, something we should be striving for, even as we begin to rethink, for example, very fundamental questions about society, the environment. And so I think that's an interesting question. And I'd like to start sort of, I think, with Tatanka. If we think about sort of reindustrialization and India, what do you see? Is this a sort of going to be purposeful strategy, or how might the Indian economy sort of reconfigure itself in the next sort of decades?
Well, it's in my knowledge, reindustrialization has not been a word with political effect for quite some time. Not even industrialization nor deindustrialization. Nobody worries because the service sector has been doing well. India's nearest benchmark, the benchmark that it compares with all the time, is China. And from the late 20th century, China industrialized, but India did managed pretty good growth rates by not industrializing, by going in another direction, and that seemed to work. I think what's happening increasingly is that this word is coming back partly because of the COVID-related worries and the fact that India is producing an enormous quantity of vaccines for the world has something to do with can we build on this advantage? Reindustrialization will be a part of the vocabulary of policymaking in near future, based on that experience, but it will be a different kind of rebuilding. It's not a new development policy. It's about security. It's about being self-sufficient in where self-sufficiency matters. It's about disaster response, very much colored by what the world has gone through in 2020.
Very good. There's been some questions as well, sort of related to this point about sort of, the impact and the role around sort of, the evolving environmental and sustainability agenda, and, the extent to which this is both, obviously significant challenge, but also opportunity, in terms of sort of using advanced technologies. People are going, this technology is going to have to be built. It's going to have to be manufactured for it to be deployed. Who does that? Where does that happen? And again, is this, how's this motivated? I think this is what, back to Rosemary's sort of, sort of comments around sort of, the role of the market and the company. Who motivates this? Is this a policy prescription that comes in? Is this government that mandates this, or is this coming up from a much more private-led sort of response to this? So I think those were sort of picking up on some of the questions in the chat there. So perhaps if we go to Graham, any perspectives on this?
Okay. So, if we go back to the starting point I made about the demand supply of manufactured goods, we're not seeing at the global level, as far as I can see, a decline in global demand for manufactured goods. We're speaking through Zoom, see a service, but through manufactured products, computers, etc. And that links us into Zoom and the idea of corporate structures and strategies. And I think that's where I see the story. I see the story as a story of corporate strategy, shaping corporate structures. And then on planet Earth, as Rosemary was saying, that we have footloose competition for talent. And so if you're Nike, okay, where do you create your value? Well, you're going to manufacture your sneakers in, say, Vietnam or Bangladesh, because there's cheap labor to make sneakers there. But if you're going to talk about the design capabilities, the advertising and marketing, who the people you stick in adverts are globally, etc., that's not going to be Vietnam, Bangladesh. That's going to be the United States. So there's different parts within the company's strategy is going to create different levels of value. The great danger within the developed world is that there are haves and have-nots. In other words, in the developed world, we're now seeing a situation where the agglomerations of those skilled locations, which can compete for that skilled manufactured work, where people can relearn, retrain, and are flexible. So again, back to Germany, the Nordics, etc. And that all shows up in the the Gatsby curve and all that sort of stuff. But who are the losers? Well, the United States and UK are two of the big losers of that. So I think there's an issue about the flexibility and what we regard as skills, etc. So I think there's an issue about corporate strategy, and there's a wider social issue about skills. There's a wider issue about what is good education, etc., etc. A lot of this takes us out of the classic literature of the economics of deindustrialization to what I would say is a neuro focus, where we really should think about the social implications of industrialization and deindustrialization. These are tied in with agglomerations. The fact that the UK has a much wider regional gap than a lot of its income peers. That ties us into the role of the City of London, and it ties us into the stuff Angus Deaton's been writing about deaths of despair. The great value of manufacturing was the fact that you could have a shipyard here in Belfast with 25,000 people. You don't see a service equivalent of that. So in other words, when you wanted to create pools of deep labour in any community, manufacturing was that classic pool. If you, on the other hand, move to the service equivalent, you're talking something, not 25,000 people, but you're talking call centres. The problem is the call centres can move to anywhere who has the English language. And that's why, these strategies, just trying to tie my comments together, I think a lot of the focus should be on microeconomic decision making. And a lot of it should be on basic supply and demand. I think where the UK went wrong often was thinking that the solutions lay in macroeconomics and all the boring dusty books on my shelf, Cambridge in the 1970s and 80s, that were all about, shifting curves and Caldo and all that stuff. I don't think that's where we're at today. I hope that's some semblance of an answer.
Yeah. So, it's a tighter focus on the sort of the microeconomic drivers, and we're getting more granular and moving further down, and how that then sort of links into corporate strategy and how we sort of find those links. I think, yeah. Okay, Judy.
Yeah, I mean, if I add to this, I'm just going to repeat. So,
okay.
Yeah.
But re-emphasize if you want.
I think the concentration on manufacturing has, played to a particular set of a political set of people who are disenfranchised in a sense, both in the US and in the UK and in everything else. If we're talking about employment, gainful employment, productive employment, the sort of employment that gives people roles and status and everything else, that's not exclusive to manufacturing, and services are increasingly the game. But I think the points that Graham and Tatanka have made, and Rosemary's made about, where the power is going to be, where the really important lead, the management style jobs are going to be, is a very important point. The question is any region that you're interested in, Northern Ireland particularly, going to be in that game, or in the provision of services to large corporations elsewhere game?
Yeah, Rosemary, yes.
So you would expect me to say, I'm not about to set up shop or to pack up shop now. I still think there is a whole heap of hope and opportunity, and I do think that the achievement of net zero and moving towards that, one of those sort of big, hairy, audacious goals, is exactly what's needed. It's needed from our policymakers and the tactical support mechanisms in order to enable industry in its broadest sense to capitalize on that opportunity. So to do so, if you like, in a bit more of a joined up way. And so I see this much more of a tactical, there's this very strategic goal out there, but it's a more tactical play in terms of looking at regions, looking across the UK, but let's take Northern Ireland in particular, look at where are the niches where we can play as part of this bigger agenda, and how can we align skills development, technology development, capability building in our companies to seize that opportunity. And I think the examples of regions that have done very well is because they've been able to focus and align efforts around those sorts of initiatives. And I think that zero carbon or aspects of that in Northern Ireland, we've got a number, we've got a bus company, we've got companies interested in hydrogen, we've got a single water supply company in Northern Ireland, we've got some very nice hydrogen technology floating around potentially, and we have one energy regulator for Northern Ireland. So there's an opportunity to pull all those players together to say, okay, how could we make this work for Northern Ireland and punch above our weight in that particular area? There is no way we can be all things to all men and women here, but we can select certain things and go after them relentlessly. And I think that would be a great way forward. The other thing I would just say, building on some of the other comments, is that people are still buying goods, right? Yes, the service economy is growing very fast, but people still need products. And all you have to do is go back to the start of COVID and the shortage of face masks. And the lesson that everybody learned with regards to resilient, local, short supply chains. And, over the last 10 years, 20 years, the globalization of supply chains was one thing, but we had already started to see signs in industry where companies were looking for backup. It's not just having, a secondary source, but it's a tertiary source. It's a product development, skunk works, quick turnaround source. So initiatives to look at how we build resilient local supply chains, and oh, by the way, just coincidentally, they're good for carbon footprint as well. That is another huge opportunity for everyone, should we take it, not to mention the opportunity that Northern Ireland has if we can sort of find it and articulate it and market it in our unique position going forward on the edge of Europe and the UK and a quick landing spot for this side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, I think that you nice question in the chat that was saying, based on, should we be particularly worried that manufacturing now only represents 10% of NI's GDP, or is the future with services? Surely we want high productivity jobs regardless of where they are. And I think this is back to the point we're getting, which is that, we need to sort of regionally understand what we're good at, what we can specialize in, and we need to rigorously identify that and pursue that. And this sort of gets away well from sort of the picking winners idea. It's just a much more sort of focused, actually, what can we do? How can we do it really well? And what do we do to build the sort of the ecosystem and the structure around that, around skills development, which I think is becoming sort of really critical. The point about the supply chains as well, this is a big sort of trend now we've seen in sort of global, trends around globalization, has been the constriction and regionalization of supply chains and the move away from sort of very sort of dispersed global supply chains, and these are tightening for the reasons that Tatanka was mentioning around defense and around sustainability, national sustainability. So I think this presents again huge opportunities, not necessarily reshoring, but working out again what we can do and how we can sort of reconfigure supply chains around that. So I'd just like to turn to one sort of final sort of big question, really, I suppose, for everybody, is that, we're at a fairly sort of complex moment at the moment globally. We have some very significant headwinds. We have COVID. We have Brexit, we have, some sort of quite significant political instability in the United States. We've got issues in sort of political instability or political issues in large parts of the world. And of course, this has impacts on investment, public debt, capital flows, migration, talent, all of the things we've talked about. There are sort of, there's some sort of quite significant challenges being thrown up What of these do you think we need to be particularly aware of, or are going to have sort of significant lasting effects, and how might sort of corporate and policy decision makers be thinking about, you know, and adapting to these? So maybe Judy.
Well, I just want to, we haven't talked about trade barriers. For, you know, it's the elephant in the room. And while I agree that the technological behaviors that we've all adopted enable one to be employed anywhere across the, you know, around the world, if the visa requirements will let you, the trade barriers, the barriers to trade have been increasing. Globalization has been declining in terms of the globalization. So, you know, we've said that local is sustainable, and we've also talked about global, but the two actually don't match. And from the political perspective in both the US and actually in Southeast Asia, there are significant political barriers going up to exchange. And so it may be that networks become more local, and that has human capital implications, because it means that the rights that you have are curtailed. All the macroeconomic textbooks that Graham were talking about, because Chris was talking about, say that those barriers inhibit productivity. You know, that's what globalization was meant to be about, was, you know, market integration. So I think there are undoubtedly opportunities, new opportunities. The question is, will they be as productive as the previous model? And that is something we actually don't know. There's some good research you can do on it with case studies, but it's unknown at the moment.
Great. Graham?
Yeah, I was going to add to that. I think the biggest challenge actually is escaping bad ideas, because one of the key lessons of the whole Brexit debate was, one of the reasons why I think the economics profession, I don't think, performed particularly well during the Brexit debate, was because I don't think the economics profession really grasped the net of the benefit on costs of UK membership of the European community to the UK economy. If you go back to British entry literature of the late 60s, early 70s, it didn't grasp what transpired. And what transpired, and I'll use the term myself with Nick's Craft's argument, but I'll use the term essentially tug of war. That in 1972-73, Britain was a sick man of Europe. On the one hand, it had forces that were driving down productivity, driving down competition, etc., and it needed the tug of war for something to raise productivity, raise competition, innovation, etc. British membership, UK membership through the EEC did that. It moved the tug of war in favour of greater competition, a greater efficiency, greater productivity. So the big threat to the UK, and as my paper from last year, on the Social Review about Northern Ireland, is that productivity competition is key. Okay, Northern Ireland's the lowest productivity in the UK and has lower competition. And go back to Alison Cuthbert 55 and go back all that. So Northern Ireland actually needed European membership of market access more than any other region in the United Kingdom. Okay, so what we're talking about in the language of economic history is we need substitutes for prerequisites. We need something to substitute for the benefits we got from being in the European community. Whatever costs you want to talk a bit about, or the sovereignty or whatever, fine. But there were economic benefits. And nobody really sat down and turned around and said, what is the alternative strategy for Northern Ireland PLC now that we're out? Okay? And that, for Northern Ireland, I'm just talking Northern Ireland, perhaps for the UK, because a lot of Northern Ireland's problems are magnifications of British problems. And that's the key point I think we haven't really addressed in our policy documents or in our politics or whatever. So that's me getting off the fence.
Thank you, Graham. Tatanka, so from the Indian perspective, sort of the big opportunities, challenges we're facing now, sort of what do you see?
Yeah, well, globally, Judy mentioned barriers to trade, and I think that's absolutely right, that the formal barriers have gone up and probably rise more. And from the Indian perspective, again, I mean, one can see that protectionism is coming back in political discourse. However, the world has also seen ways that seem that look like bypassing these barriers. And we still don't understand the full potential of these mechanisms. And I'll just mention two of these mechanisms. One is remote working, which has been mentioned before. I mean, this is a beast which has been let loose, but we still don't understand what it can do. And it's very early stages of understanding what remote working really means in terms of global exchanges, communication. The second thing is that if you look at the data on international migrants, one of the biggest components, probably the largest component, are students, not workers. And that's going up. That's going up. That's going to strengthen enormously in the coming years, because the entire emerging world, and that's a really big part. I mean, I'm not just talking about the economies that are growing rapidly, but a very big part of the world believes that the best investment is in children's education, and especially higher education. So that is, but there are not enough institutions available locally. So that's going up, and that means there's a kind of churning in the labor market that is going to come, on which which the policies are really not prepared for. They don't understand it very well, and it's going to come in this way. Not migrants with work visa, but people who first educate themselves in a global place and then join the labor market.
Yeah, great. Rosemary?
Well, I think the old adage here is never to waste a good crisis, right? And we certainly have one of those. In fact, we've got a number of them all happening simultaneously. We have the pandemic crisis, we have the Brexit and the whole new Northern Ireland Protocol and the whole trade position, UK with the UK and the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, and we have the digitization of economies all around the world and everything going online and servicization, and we have the zero carbon. So all of those things, and I think it really comes down to all of the parties that we've talked about. So we've talked about sort of the policymakers. We've talked about our sort of universities, our colleges, our companies. Together and identify what is the appropriate best way forward for each of the regions in which we operate. And I think truly in Northern Ireland, we need to do that. And in fairness to our politicians, it's very difficult. I mean, we're in a situation with our executive and assembly in Northern Ireland where they've basically got pretty much another year. And what we need are medium to long-term strategies, as well as what we're going to do in the next year. And that's where bodies such as Graham's Productivity Forum, such as the Economic Advisory Group, such as the Makers Panel, and all sorts of cross society bodies can help step in to say, okay, what are the things that we need to focus on in Northern Ireland, and being very specific around where we have opportunities, where we have challenges, and making some, quite frankly, tough decisions. I mean, it's surprising, but Northern Ireland doesn't have an advanced manufacturing strategy. Yeah, we had a draft industrial plan just before sort of the previous assembly collapsed, but I don't think it's down just to the policymakers to do that. I think the manufacturing community have a role to play, and Invest has a role to play as a sort of a facilitator, enabler, honest broker in this, to try and pull those sectors together in Northern Ireland. So I am not disheartened. I actually have quite a lot of hope. We have areas, so this sort of nanotechnology corridor, Seagate up in the northwest in Northern Ireland. So getting a group of companies motivated, energized, and focused around that, and maybe some support into that area. We've got other sort of in the biomarkers arena opportunities there. And then we've got just the whole sort of manufacturing community of itself, helping itself and each other to digitize and improve fundamental productivity. And I think that's going to be the way out of this. It's all of our responsibilities, frankly.
I think this links into a nice question that we got, which was about sort of the, the Haldane's productivity thesis about the, the pursuit of excellence and global competitiveness at the top, but then you end up with a long tail of underperforming companies with weaker management, slow adoption of tech, weak diffusion of sort of new technologies. What do we do to support these companies? And I like your point, Rosemary, that, really this can't just be all sort of top-down government policy. It has to be sort of intra-industrial sort of bodies and groups that sort of evolved to, that we think much more closely around the Mittelstadt and, ways in which we think about industrial groupings, coalescing and acting together and supporting each other. And then this comes back to a lot of points which have been about sort of, the fact that there's a lot of very small companies. How can you be sort of globally competitive? How can you be sort of excellent? Well, it's not, as you go back, it's not necessarily about global competition. It's about, just being more productive and higher quality and sort of developing and pulling yourself up to, from where you are now, and how we do that, and the role the state plays in supporting the individual in a sort of a lifelong learning journey around skills and development. And back to Tank's point about how that sort of ties in then with skills and education and the migration that occurs around that to support that, and that this, we need to intersect these quite carefully and closely. But listen, we're very close to time now. We've had lots of questions. I've tried to sort of bring them in sort of into the conversation as we've gone. I've tried to get to as many as I can. There's lots of really interesting points there. So I'd just like to thank all of you, all the participants, all the questions. And particularly I'd like to thank all our panelists, of course. So thanks to Rosemary, to Judy, to Graham and to Tanka for all of your comments and thoughts on this, which is, it's a difficult societal challenge that we're going to face. And I think some of the, I hope what we've shown today is the importance of thinking of this over the long run, that, as we understand processes of industrialization and deindustrialization, by seeing the long run antecedents, the way this has flown, the way this has sort of evolved over time, indicates that we have to have a long run perspective in identifying solutions going forward. The role of the ecosystems, the role of policy in the state, particularly around reskilling and the supporting of workers, around skills and human capital, and then the role of the market and sort of encouraging from individual companies to industrial clusters, how they can engage in sort of these, efforts to engage with technology and skills and capabilities are all going to be sort of part of this. And then there's some even more fundamental questions about, what kind of economy do we want? How should this economy fit within sort of, societal demands and hopes around the environment and around sort of newly configured global world? These are all going to be sort of complex ideas that we have to grapple with, but I hope we've provided with you some interesting food for thought here, some interesting ideas and sort of concepts that we can sort of play around with a bit. So thank you to all. Thanks again to the panelists, and we hope that we will be able to see you at another of our events very soon.
Yeah, thank you to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Very much for organizing this.
Such good questions and everything. Cool.
Okay.